Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a Detroit Regional Chamber Town Hall. My name is Brad Williams. I lead our government relations and public policy work here at the Detroit Regional Chamber. And we have an exciting topic, a hopeful topic to talk about today, and that is the vaccine and the progress of the vaccine and really what it means for employers and what can be required, what are your obligations as employers. And so we brought in some really exceptional experts on this from Dykema. So let me introduce to you from Dykema. One second here. Let me introduce to you Elisa Lintemuth from Dykema and Melvin Muskovitz from Dykema, who are going to share some information with us on the vaccine today. And there is a lot to be said today about this. So I want to start off by letting you know that there is a document to be seen that you can download in the GoToWebinar function. And so starting there, you can download that and you can get all the information that you need. The other thing you should know is typically as we have done these town halls over the course of the last 10 months, and gosh, it really bothers me that we've been doing these for 10 months, but we have been doing these for 10 months. We've been trying to take questions from the audience, but we know we've got an especially large audience today because of the popularity of the topic. We also know that we're going to have a lot of questions that are really tailored to specific businesses. So we're not really going to be able to take audience questions today, but we have Elisa and Mel's contact information in that document. So please take advantage of that. But I'm going to start in asking questions of Mel and Elisa, and hopefully that covers your question. But if not, please feel free to reach out to them. But Mel, first thing I'm going to ask you is, I guess the question on everyone's mind that brought us here today is the big question: can employers require employees to be vaccinated against COVID-19? Can we require our employees to get this vaccination? And if so, what are the exceptions, if any?
That's obviously the big question, and a lot of the questions that will follow kind of flow from that. There are no laws that outright prohibit a mandatory vaccination requirement. Two statutes, however, do come into play. One is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which protects employees with disabilities, and the other is the Civil Rights Act, Title VII, which protects employees from religious discrimination. Both statutes come under the jurisdiction of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The EEOC's position is that an employer can require employees be vaccinated as long as it provides exemptions for employees who are prevented from receiving the vaccine due either to a disability or a sincerely held religious belief or practice. The exemption is what is considered by the EEOC to be an accommodation. One caveat is that an employer does not have to provide an accommodation that would cause the employer an undue hardship. The EEOC's guidance has been accepted by the courts.
So what qualifies as a disability, for example, for the purposes of an ADA exemption?
In the context here, to qualify for an ADA exemption, an employee must have a condition that prevents them from safely receiving a vaccination. Examples include generally a serious allergy to any ingredient in the vaccine, specifically a history of a specific syndrome referred to as Guillain-Barré, that's spelled Guillain-Barré. The EEOC has also advised employers should accommodate a pregnant employee's request to not be vaccinated. Minor sensitivities and undocumented allergies are likely to be insufficient to entitle an employee to an exemption. Employers do, however, have discretion to be more liberal in granting an exemption under the ADA. And in this regard, it's important to know that the FDA has issued fact sheets for both vaccines. And in those fact sheets, they advise individuals to inform the vaccination provider if they are immunocompromised or on a medicine affecting their immune system. And in addition to being pregnant, if they plan on becoming pregnant or are breastfeeding. Presumably, there's a medical reason for suggesting this information be provided, in the likelihood that an employee's caregiver would recommend that the employee not receive the vaccine if they have one of those other conditions, or the employee may reach that conclusion on their own. It's also important to know that neither the disability nor the need for accommodation, if the disability or the need for accommodation, if they're not obvious, an employer may ask the employee for reasonable documentation about the nature and severity of the impairment and why the condition prevents them from receiving safely the vaccination. We recommend that depending on the size of the company or employer, only one or a very limited number of employees should ask these questions. The responses should be shared only with individuals who have a need to know, and anything in writing must be kept separate from the employee's personnel file.
Now, what about sincerely held religious beliefs, Mel? I know I heard from another attorney that, for example, vegans could not take the vaccine under sincerely held religious belief, or at least that's been challenged or litigated before. What qualifies as a sincerely held religious belief?
Well, the ADA, the disability is somewhat vague. The religious exemption is probably even more vague. What is considered a sincerely held religious belief or practice is broad and subjective. Importantly, it does not need to be a, quote, mainstream, quote, belief of any organized religion. So in this regard, the EEOC considers religious practices to include what they refer to as sincerely held moral or ethical beliefs as to what is right and wrong. Contrast to political, medical, or intellectual beliefs opposing vaccinations would not entitle someone to a religious exemption. Where that line is drawn, though, is difficult to determine. An employer can, however, request supporting information from the employee. However, to do so, they have to have an objective basis for questioning either the religious nature of the belief or the sincerity of a particular belief, practice, or observance.
Okay, so Elisa, let's turn to you for a minute. How are employers required to accommodate employees who have a valid exemption?
So if an employee requests an accommodation to a mandatory vaccine policy based on a disability or a religious belief, the employer may only deny the accommodation if it would result in an undue hardship to the employer. And the undue hardship standard differs depending on whether the request is made based on a religious belief or a disability. So an undue hardship based on a religious belief is defined as being more than a de minimis cost or burden. That's not an extremely high standard to meet. The standard is higher under the ADA, where the undue hardship analysis is defined as a significant difficulty or expense. But under both standards, it would be an undue hardship if the accommodation resulted in a direct threat to the health and safety of the employee's coworkers, or other third parties. However, it's important to note that even if there is a finding of direct threat, that doesn't mean that the employer can automatically terminate the employee. The employer has to determine whether there is any other accommodation that would permit the employee to perform the essential functions of his or her job without imposing a threat to others. So Some potential accommodations that employers might want to consider would be transferring an employee to a position that does not require interaction with others, requiring the employee to work remotely, relocating the employee's workspace to eliminate interaction with others, requiring the employee to attend all meetings remotely, or potentially altering the employee's work schedule to reduce the amount of time spent in the workplace with other employees.
So what if there aren't any reasonable accommodations, though? I mean, I can think of instances, you're describing all these reasonable accommodations, and frankly, some of them don't seem all that reasonable, but what if there aren't any reasonable accommodations?
So the employer could always provide unpaid leave to the employee until the virus spread is more controlled or we achieve herd immunity. This is really a fact-specific case-by-case analysis. And if there are no viable, reasonable accommodations and the employer is considering termination, we would recommend that they engage counsel to analyze the specific facts of each case so that they don't become the poster child for the first lawsuits challenging mandatory vaccination.
That's always smart, I would say. Mel, what can we do if an employee refuses to be vaccinated and doesn't claim that any of these kind of exemptions apply to them? So, they just say, you know what, I just don't want to be vaccinated. We all know there are folks out there who are, opposed to being vaccinated.
So subject to some limitations, an employer has discretion, including up to termination of employment, when an employee who is not exempt refuses to be vaccinated. Limitations would include whether the company, through its policies or contract with an individual employee, has defined cause, that the employee can only be terminated for cause. And then the issue is whether the definition of cause includes refusal to, certainly your policy likely wouldn't say refusal to be vaccinated, but a policy may say refusal to follow company policy is grounds for termination. So if you have an employee who absolutely refuses without an exemption to be vaccinated and you have a mandatory policy, you would need to look at your policies and any individual contract you have with that individual. Secondly, if you're a unionized employer, you would want to look at the terms of your collective bargaining agreement to determine whether, if there's a just cause provision for termination, which most union contracts have, whether that would be considered just cause for termination. Third limitation, even if there's no restrictions in policy or contract, is that the decision to terminate would have to be applied in a non-discriminatory way. So, for example, if older employees who refused to be vaccinated were terminated, but younger employees were not, and there was not a legitimate business reason for distinguishing between the two groups, terminating only the older workers would give those employees a strong case for age discrimination based on a disparate treatment theory. A lot of issues to deal with here. Again, looking at your policies, contract, and considering the discrimination-related issues need to be taken into consideration.
So, Elisa, can we ask, or as employers, can we ask our employees for proof of their vaccination? I see people now on social media kind of taking pictures of their vaccination card, but can we ask our employees to see those vaccination cards?
Yes, and in fact, the EEOC issued recent guidance a couple weeks ago here now, and that guidance is really helpful to employers on this specific issue, because the EEOC stated that requiring an employee to show proof of COVID-19 vaccination is not a disability-related inquiry. I think a lot of folks thought it might be, before the EEOC guidance came out. And what that means is that it decreases the risk of litigation under the ADA. You can ask employees for proof of vaccination without worrying about that.
Now, if we have these employees who don't get vaccinated, the folks we were just talking about with Mel, can we ask them why they chose not to get vaccinated? Or is that a privacy concern as an employer?
So if an employer asks an employee why he or she did not receive a vaccination, it may elicit information about a disability or pregnancy or something like that, which would need to be kept confidential and would increase the risk of liability for a discrimination claim. An employer could simply, ask the employee if they had a request for an accommodation based on a disability or religious belief. And if the answer is no, move forward based on that answer. And if the answer is yes, then, make sure that the employee is filling out the right paperwork. You can ask, but it just might increase liability, I guess is the point, the more you explore the reasons for their decision not to get vaccinated.
Right. Sometimes there's just questions you don't want to know the answer to.
Right.
So Mel, both of you, I'm sure, have plenty of clients who are kind of weighing these decisions right now, right? So what are most employers in Michigan doing? Are they requiring a vaccine, or are they encouraging it? What is, in your experience, what choices are employers making right now?
My experience has been that at least my clients are either not dealing with it at all initially, waiting, but I think they're kind of ramping up their decision process now as the vaccine is becoming more available. I have not had clients mandate a vaccination at this point. Interesting, some of the largest employers in the state, and some that you might expect would mandate a vaccination given the nature of their of the entity, specifically Beaumont Health System and the University of Michigan Hospital, have not been requiring employees to be vaccinated. I think what employers are looking at is the fact that if they have a mandatory policy, then they're going to have to get into the issue of whether they have to provide an exemption for religion and disability reasons, and have to get into that. There's somewhat of a general unease regarding the FDA approval process. A high percentage of the population is opposed to vaccines. CBS this morning had a report from LinkedIn that a recent survey had 46% of employees wanted their employers to have mandatory policies. 40% did not. 16, the balance 14 were unsure. The fact that this issue has become polarized, I think employers are shying away from making it mandatory.
So Elisa, let's fast forward to, this time, and fingers crossed, we've all had our second dose of the vaccine. Are we going to be able to go back to normal the way things were a year ago? How soon is it going to be that we go back to normal, at least in the workplace?
So initially, we're not going to be able to go right back to normal. First, current mask and social distancing orders don't include exemptions for individuals who've been vaccinated. So the current orders would require employers to continue enforcing mask and social distancing rules. Second, the CDC has cautioned that there's not enough information yet to determine if or when it will stop recommending that people wear masks and avoid close contact based on vaccination. And this is because it's not clear yet whether a vaccine prevents someone from carrying and spreading COVID-19. And it's not clear when we will achieve herd immunity. The percentage of the population that needs to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity varies from disease to disease and how contagious it is. And we've got these new strains of COVID-19, which are reportedly more contagious. So I think, it's a bottom threshold of 70% of people to achieve herd immunity, but it may be higher than that.
So Mel, can we offer, if you mentioned earlier that, some employers are shying away from requiring this, but can employers offer incentives to increase employee participation, whether it's financial or non-financial? Is there something else employers can be doing besides requiring it?
There are generally two types of incentives that employers have considered. One falls into a group of protecting employees from not having adverse consequences, financial consequences, as a result of being vaccinated. So, for example, employers are not docking in employees' pay, and this would particularly be relevant for hourly employees who are able to get vaccinated, but because of the appointment they have, it can only be done during when they would otherwise be working. So to pay those employees for the hours that they missed in order to get vaccinated. Secondly, while reactions to the vaccine have been somewhat limited, it is possible that an employee could have a negative reaction to a vaccination and miss a couple of days of work or perhaps more. And the employers are considering continuing to pay the employee as if they worked and not requiring the employee to use their paid leave bank. So that's kind of one category. The other category is providing them with either a cash incentive or some other incentive, whether it's a gift card or something of that nature, upon getting vaccinated. The issue here is that because employees who are not able to get vaccinated because of a disability, they would not be able to take advantage of and get this benefit. And that has implications under the ADA. So employers considering cash incentives really need to consult legal counsel with respect to their compliance with the latest EEOC guidelines and government regulations, some of which are in the process of being updated and hopefully will be out soon. But it's important that if you're going to do a cash incentive, that you make sure that you're in compliance with those guidelines.
So, all of this, Mel, is, the best intentions always are going to, even the best intentions are going to generate complaints from our employees. So do you have recommendations on how employers should deal with that?
Yes, most definitely. First of all, it's important to know that if a group of employees, which is defined as two or more, or one employee speaking on behalf of others, that doing that would be considered to be protected activity under the National Labor Relations Act. And in this context, the National Labor Relations Act would apply to both union and non-union employers. So when an employee is engaging in protected action about terms and conditions of employment, they are protected from being retaliated against or suffering an adverse action because they complained. An exception to that is that if in the context of complaining, the employees engage in physical threats or threatening behavior, then they would lose their protection. But merely by virtue of complaining, the employer should not take adverse action against the employees. Rather, what we recommend is assume these complaints or concerns are raised in good faith and address the employees' concerns. The employees may have good suggestions on tweaking policies or on other issues related to that. They may be misinformed, and you can take that opportunity to inform them. There's a lot of anxiety with respect both to COVID, with respect to the circumstances that have occurred over the last 10 months or so, and with the vaccine. And so cutting employees some slack is a good approach here. One thing that we have been advising our clients as to prevent or to minimize complaints or concerns is to be proactive and to provide education to employees ahead of the vaccine policy, training supervisors, and implementing and disseminating a policy to employees, and also providing them with a trusted source, preferably from outside the agency, maybe someone connected with the health insurance carrier who can answer an employee's questions. So again, these are difficult times, and the employer doesn't want to exacerbate problems in the workplace.
So, Elisa, I can think of situations in which, different employer groups where you might want to have some people in a mandatory vaccination situation, but maybe it's not applicable to everyone. Maybe it's a healthcare field or something else where you'd want your frontline workers a mandatory vaccination, but maybe your administrators, it's not as necessary. Is that allowed? Or is that something you would recommend?
It's allowed if the distinction between groups of employees is made based on legitimate, non-discriminatory business reasons. So the example you gave may be a good instance where a distinction would be made. Another one might be that an employer might require all employees whose work must be performed in person to receive a vaccine, but the employer might not mandate vaccination for those employees whose duties can be performed remotely.
And what about companies that have unionized employees? How does that, I know that always adds a layer of complication. Can you kind of go through what that might be in this instance?
Sure. So mandatory vaccination policies may well be a mandatory subject of bargaining. It really depends on the terms of your collective bargaining agreement and whether that topic is addressed or has been waived. And so that's going to require a close look at the terms of your agreement. But even if you're not required to bargain over the policy, it would be helpful to have support from union leadership and to better understand employee concerns. So with this in mind, we recommend that you have a conversation with union leadership and engage with them before you implement a mandatory vaccination policy.
I have one last question because we are getting close to our 11:30 quit time that we promised for everybody. But I'm going to ask you both to answer it. And this is kind of a wrap-up question, but what are the logistical and practical concerns that our employers who are listening in on this should be thinking about as they are approaching, a time where, frankly, a lot of their employees are about to get vaccinated, whether they are requiring it, incenting it, or taking a hands-off approach? What should our employers be thinking about logistically and practically for the next probably 6 months before we all get the second shot in our arm? Mel, why don't you go first?
A couple of things that I would emphasize. The best laid company plans, which may be drafted, through the Human Resources Office and personnel or health and safety groups, will only be as good as they are supported by both supervisors and the highest echelon in the company. And so all the efforts that go into making sure employees understand the policy and are comfortable with it and all the positive things that companies say on their behalf can be undermined if there's not a team approach, and if their supervisors, and management level employees, including up the chain to the CEO, are not on board. Secondly, this issue has come up with respect to if an employee contracted COVID and they thought that it was done happened at work. There's a proof issue as to whether that's the case or not. But with vaccinations, if an employee has an adverse reaction to it, that would be easy to prove as to what the causation was. And the employer should alert their workers' comp carrier because depending on how serious the condition is, there may be an aspect of that it would be covered under workers' compensation because it's something the employer required or strongly recommended, and there may be protection for the company in that way. So if that were to occur, you don't want to lose the ability to have your work comp carrier defend it by failing to notify them in a timely manner.
Elisa, how about you? Final thoughts?
Sure. So I know one thing that a lot of employers are doing who are currently vaccinating employees is they are staggering vaccination for some of their key employees so that to the extent that there is an adverse reaction, they have adequate staffing for business continuity purposes. The other big point that I think should be made is this is an evolving area of law, and we expect that the guidance in this area will continue to evolve and be updated as we learn more about the virus, more about the vaccines, and certain agencies like OSHA just haven't weighed in yet. So keep an eye on guidance and be ready to pivot if you need to based on that guidance.
Well, thank you both. I'd like to thank Elisa Lintemuth, who's a member of the Labor Employment Practice at Dykema, and Mel Muskovitz, who's senior counsel with the Labor and Employment Practice at Dykema, who gave us a lot of great information today about the vaccination and employers and how a mandatory vaccination program might work and what role employers can play in vaccination. So thank you both very much. As I mentioned at the top, we weren't able to take questions in this one just because of the numbers of folks who were participating in this, but both Elisa and Mel have left their contact information in the document that's available in your GoToWebinar program. So please take a look at that. And if you have specific questions, please feel free and reach out to them. I will also note that this session has been recorded and is going to be available on the Chamber website, detroitchamber.com/COVID-19. So please share this with your friends, your coworkers who will find this information helpful. And we will look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.